On behalf of our General President, Sean O'Brien, and our General Secretary Treasurer, Fred Zuckerman, and our Director for the HRDC, Anthony Rosa, we welcome you. Thank you for taking this time out. Today, we're going to be talking about Bayard Rustin and the Civil Rights Revolution. And it's going to be presented today by Professor Eric Arnesen. He's the Teamsters Professor of Modern American Labor History at the George Washington University. The Human Rights and Diversity Commission, in conjunction with the Teamsters History Projects, welcomes the next segment of the monthly history programs based on Teamsters, the labor movement, and the diversity within our union. Following this presentation of Mr. Arnesen, there'll be a question and answer period. Please feel free to join in and ask your questions. We're also joined by Karen Jones and Paul Trujillo of the Education Department. And with that, please, let's move forward. And Mr. Arnesen, take it away.
All right, thank you. Allow me a moment to share my screen. All right, everyone can see this?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, or for those of you on the West Coast this morning. I realize that this is a day that most people have nothing to do. There's nothing really going on. I think there's some competition with some sporting event later in the day. But this obviously, to my mind, is far, far more important than that little thing called Super Bowl. Anyhow, thank you all for being here. This session is something of a first, a discussion of a recent film that appeared on Netflix, where it is currently streaming. For many people, I'm discovering the Obama-produced Netflix program was their first introduction to Bayard Rustin, and his role in the civil rights movement. And I should just say at the outset that my anxiety level, my nervousness level went way up when I saw that one of the folks who is watching today happens to be one of the historical figures in the Rustin biopic. And I hope Rochelle Horowitz will have something to say when we get to the discussion period at the end. So I'm delighted that she can join us. I'm delighted that everyone else here as well. So I imagine that it's not only Rustin that most people or many people haven't heard of, Anna Arnold Hedgeman for one, or Ella Baker, perhaps Roy Wilkins. My sense is that the popular understanding of the civil rights movement is largely dominated, even today, around the role, the image, the mythology built up around Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But today's session is about Bayard Rustin, and this film, I think, is many people's introduction to the man and to his contribution in the 1963 March on Washington. As the film makes clear, Rustin played a major role in the civil rights movement, and as the film perhaps doesn't make clear, that role extended well beyond, both before and after, the 1963 March. Over the years, various commentators have made the case for Rustin's importance. Peter Dreyer once noted that Rustin was, and I quote, a pacifist, a radical, Black, and gay, not exactly well positioned to influence mid-century America. And yet, he continued, Rustin did just that. From the 1940s through the 1960s, and I would add through the 1980s, quote, he marshaled his considerable talents as an organizer, strategist, speaker, and writer to challenge the economic and racial status quo. Always an outsider, he helped to catalyze the civil rights movement, end quote. But as many commentators have noted, I'm writing a biography of Randolph, so he's often or always on my mind. Rustin is not always well remembered today. He remains in our current moment, as one writer put it some 2 decades ago, one of history's forgotten men. And this author posed the question, why? Why has Rustin's historical significance been so diluted and obscured? End quote. In recent years, it's not that historians have ignored Rustin. Actually, there are a number of major biographies that have appeared over the past generation. Jervis Anderson, a New Yorker writer, journalist, biographer, produced the first substantive account of Rustin's life. My former colleague, John D'Amelio, produced another, one that highlighted, in addition to Rustin's pacifism and civil rights activism, his sexuality. Rustin was a gay man who came of age when that was a dangerous thing to be. But he didn't hide it. And D'Amelio's biography is a very good one that I would recommend highly. To those liking history on the shorter side, I'd recommend Gerald Poder's very readable account. Rustin wasn't only an activist, he was a writer, he was an intellectual, he was a thinker, he was a movement strategist who put his thoughts on paper a lot. And over the years, a number of documentary collections of his writings have appeared in print. There are some 4 volumes that are pictured here in this slide. And here are 3 of those volumes from my bookshelf that I pulled off for this afternoon. And for the younger set, there's a small but growing literature on Rustin for kids, 4 of which I have featured here in this particular slide. And outside of the realm of biographers, of the academy, of the publishing industry, the memory of the historical and inspirational Rustin has been kept alive by some in the labor movement. The American Federation of Teachers, the United Federation of Teachers here in New York, there's one, and here also on this slide is a page from a kind of a testimonial program that the Teamsters sponsored many years ago. Over the years, numerous biographical profiles have appeared in the popular press. This one from the Saturday Evening Post in 1964 called Rustin the Lone Wolf of Civil Rights and described him as a leader without followers, feared, admired, and lonely genius behind the Negroes' massive demonstrations. Jump ahead a little bit to 1969, the New York Times called him a strategist without a movement, a notion that I'll return to in a bit. And in more recent years, Rustin, from time to time, has become the focus of newspaper and magazine reflections on his role in the movement. Here on the left of the screen, from the Philadelphia Daily News in 2013, Rustin is described as a forgotten hero, a man who left a giant footnote. And from the Catholic Weekly Commonweal from 2012, Rustin was the man behind the march. And in 2003, Rustin was the subject of a terrific documentary, Brother Outside. And it is available also on Netflix, I discovered, in preparing for today's session. I watched it once again last night. So I would highly recommend, for those of you who want to learn more about Rustin, the activist, the person, his political career before and after the events of the current Netflix biopic, I would strongly recommend clicking on Netflix and watching this film. Now, in my remaining time today, I want to lay out a little bit of biographical information about Rustin and to try to situate him in a larger context of political activism in the mid-20th century. So, some basic background. He was born in 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He was raised in a Quaker household by his grandmother. According to one biographical account, growing up, he demonstrated quite a keen sense of optimism, drive, motivation, and leadership, plunging into his education with passion. His classmates recalled that he had no equal in terms of academic subjects and few in arts or athletics. He was a debater and a football player, an offensive lineman. And as for the arts, he was a tenor and a harpsichord player. In his later years, he recorded albums. You get a little sense of this from the performance in the biopic that we're here to talk about. After attending Wilberforce College, he made his way to New York City. He enrolled at City College of New York. He met and mingled with assorted radicals in that city. And in the late 1930s, he joined the Young Communist League. This was a fateful decision, one that would haunt him, as the current Netflix film makes clear, for many years to come. And as a young communist, he came to the attention of the FBI, and these are some excerpts from FBI files, and he remained in the FBI sights for decades to come. But like many who joined the party, he left. He didn't stay in it for that long. The party was a political way station. It was not a political home. Rustin remained a Quaker. He believed deeply in nonviolence. He joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a pacifist organization in the early 1940s, which became his kind of political organizational home for many, many years. Now, the early 1940s was the moment at which the United States entered the Second World War. And Black protest during the war was considerable. And as I've argued and I've written about, the March on Washington movement, which was the brainchild of A. Philip Randolph, the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, became the most prominent civil rights organization, I would suggest, or at least one of the more visible civil rights organizations of the war years. Rustin joined the youth division of the March on Washington movement. And he participated in various events. Here in 1943, he participated in a March on Washington conference. He was a speaker at various events. Now, the March on Washington movement, about which I could speak for hours, but I promise I won't, in effect, forced President Roosevelt's hand in threatening to bring 100,000 African Americans to the nation's capital to protest discrimination in the defense industries and in the armed forces. Roosevelt conceded and issued Executive Order 8802, which ostensibly desegregated or called for non-discrimination, rather, in defense industries. This was a signal achievement at the time. The war involved conscription. And Rustin received his papers from the government in 1943. But he was a conscientious objector. As a Quaker, as a believer in nonviolence, he wrote to the Selective Service Board to inform them that he would not serve, plain and simple. And he was prepared to take the consequences of that stance, which he did. For his beliefs, he went to prison, sentenced to a 3-year term, which began in 1944 and ended in 1946. And when he was released, he once again threw himself into a whirlwind of activism, traveling the country, speaking in churches and college campuses, preaching the gospel of nonviolence, amongst other things. He was tireless and was recognized as a powerful and moving speaker. And as one audience member put it, writing before Rustin's incarceration, this in 1942, quote, "More than one member of the audience," this person said that it had been one of the most stirring experiences for them to have heard and known Bayard Rustin, end quote. And as you can see from the two posters here, that his topics ranged widely, in this case from civil rights to Christian living. And he attempted to put his philosophy, his belief in the power and efficacy of nonviolence and of nonviolent protest into action. In 1947, he participated in what was called the Journey of Reconciliation, a protest designed to test laws mandating segregation on public transportation in the South. And for his efforts, he was arrested and convicted and spent some 3 weeks or so on a North Carolina chain gang, forced to perform heavy labor, an experience that he would write about and publicize upon his release from the North Carolina jail. Rustin also participated in the campaign to desegregate the armed forces. The military in the United States through the Second World War was a Jim Crow institution. It segregated white from black soldiers were often confined to labor brigades, performing the more menial, though absolutely necessary work to make the military function. The war's greatest scandal was the way the March on Washington movement described the story of Jim Crow in uniform during the war. After the war, A. Philip Randolph launched again a campaign to desegregate the armed forces. Prison is better than Army Jim Crow service. You can see him carrying a sign here, marching outside of the Democratic National Convention in the summer of 1948. And Rustin was a key part of this alliance between Randolph and some of his compatriots and the pacifist community in pushing a campaign that called upon young African-American men to refuse service in a Jim Crow army. And for even uttering these words and taking this stand, they were essentially accused of treason before Congress. But it was an election year. The issue was compelling. And in the end, they prevailed. And President Truman signed an executive order that began the gradual process of desegregating the armed forces. Didn't happen overnight, but the ball was set into motion. And Rustin had been a key part of this crusade. He was actually not happy when the crusade was called off, but he ultimately went along with it with little choice there. For his various activities, Rustin was recognized, at least within the peace community. And here, this slide notes he received, along with others, an award for his campaigning. Now, let me just fast forward to the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 1956. The two figures that we remember about the boycott are Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Rightly so. But Rustin was on the scene, at least part of the time. He was dispatched by Randolph and others in New York to come to Montgomery. He met with King. He strongly preached the gospel of nonviolence. This is something that the Netflix biopic touches upon briefly in the backstory that we get there. And here, in this slide, you can see a picture on the right of King with Rustin in 1956. Rustin returned to New York. He wrote about his experiences. He helped to publicize the boycott outside of the South. And at one mass meeting, he wrote, "As I watched people walk away, I had the feeling that no force on earth can stop this movement," unquote. He saw something on display in Montgomery. And while the road would not be a smooth one by any stretch of the imagination, I think historians are right to note that Montgomery was a turning point, after which the civil rights movement in its reemergence looked different than it had before. Now, let me skip ahead in time, for the sake of time, to the focus of the Netflix biopic, the subject, the backdrop, the 1963 March on Washington. The film, I think, makes very clear the very crucial role that Rustin played in making the march happen and actually pulling it off. He was then and has long been recognized as the master organizer who brilliantly executed the demonstration. He worked closely with A. Philip Randolph, who was one of the public faces and one of the initiators of the march. The Netflix film goes into some of the background in which Rustin removed from the leadership of the march because of his quote-unquote controversial background. Randolph assumes the directorship, and his first move is to appoint Rustin his assistant. And basically nothing changes. Rustin runs the show. Now, what the film doesn't quite make clear is that there is a backstory to the March on Washington. There's a scene around a table in which I believe Roy Wilkins, played by Chris Rock, talks about, when has a demonstration like this ever succeeded? And a variety of early 20th century protests are referenced. There's a reference to the bonus march demonstration of the early 1930s, but not mentioned, unless I missed it in the couple of times that I watched the film, were demonstrations in the late 1950s that many of these characters participated in. Randolph, Wilkins, King participated in demonstrations, the prayer pilgrimage for freedom at the Lincoln Memorial, students, the Youth March for Integrated Schools in 1958. The idea of a mass march wasn't just something that was kind of a pipe dream, something that brought back bad memories of the bonus march. This is something that people had participated in. And the film, I think, doesn't quite get that right. Now, the documentary does get right the controversy over Rustin's background, that Strom Thurmond, the segregationist senator, and Adam Clayton Powell highlighted publicly and in meetings. Rustin's history. As a member of the Young Communist League, his arrest on what were then called morals charges in Pasadena in the early 1950s, these were made public by Strom Thurmond in an attempt to discredit Rustin and the protest march. And here, Mary McGrory, who was a syndicated columnist, writes of Rustin, he was the #1 organizer of the Civil Rights March. And this is after the demonstration, kind of lays out the charges, making clear that his record made him, quote, a favorite target of Southern segregationist senators. But as we know, Rustin didn't resign. Other leaders stood by him, and the march was a brilliant success. On that late August day in 1963, some 250,000 people, Black but also white, descended upon the nation's capital to make their voices heard. Transportation was an absolutely critical part of this, and the film highlights the role of Rochelle Horowitz in pulling off an organizational miracle of buses and trains and planes, of getting people to the nation's capital. So the attention to detail that Rustin oversaw was absolutely crucial to the march's success. Now, what we remember of the March on Washington is not necessarily the organizational brilliance behind it, but is a single moment. The speech delivered by one of multiple participants at that protest that day, Martin Luther King, and the I Have a Dream speech. And even the Netflix documentary highlights King's very powerful words on that August day. King was but one of many speakers at the March on Washington, the event that has been kind of immortalized to the extent that anyone knows anything about the civil rights movement. It's the March on Washington and that particular speech. And the media has often been, I think, complicit in reducing what we saw in the biopic to this speech. On the 50th anniversary of the demonstration in 2013, Time magazine had a cover story in which it talked about, one man and one dream. But there were many people involved, not just men, and there were many speeches and many dreams on that day. And what I think the Netflix program misses, or rather passes over all too quickly, is what this demonstration was partially conceived to be about. It was about freedom, yes, but as this picture here of Rustin on the right shows, it was for jobs and freedom. And the banner on the left that the young woman is holding shows that as well. And so African-American trade unionists, the Negro American Labor Council, Randolph as the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the economic dimension of the larger civil rights crisis was front and center in their thinking. And this was originally going to be, in their thinking, a demonstration about civil rights and jobs. And then it was broadened a bit later as others joined. If you look very closely at the signs in the Netflix program, you can see the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. But granted, I didn't hit pause very often and kind of count, because there are a lot of signs in these scenes, but there are a lot of other signs highlighting other themes as well. So if I were an advisor on this show, this program, I probably would have suggested that they highlight just a bit more the jobs and freedom dimension of the protest. Both Randolph and Rustin advocated on behalf of an economic agenda that went beyond desegregating schools, went beyond desegregating public places, and called for substantial economic reform. The demands that the march put forward, and which Rustin himself read to the crowd at the end of the demonstration that day, called for, yes, all sorts of civil rights measures, but it also called for a higher minimum wage that would allow people to live lives of dignity. It called for a Fair Employment Practice Act, harking back to the Second World War, that would bar discrimination by the government, by employers, by contractors, by employment agencies, and by trade unions, which all were guilty of engaging in discriminatory action. These were issues that both Randolph and Rustin insisted be part of this. But it was Rustin who, on that day, read these demands to the crowd. What we also don't see at the end of the film, we see very, touchingly, the top leaders head off to the White House to meet with the Kennedy administration officials, and Rustin, in some very, I think, poignant, moving scenes, stays behind and helps to collect garbage after having reproached Roy Wilkins over his importance. You're more important than someone picking up garbage, and Rustin has a very powerful retort there. But if the movie went a little bit further, where do Randolph and Rustin go the next day in Washington? To a meeting of the Socialist Party, a gathering. It's a very small party by this point, but it's a group of socialists meet to talk about where do they go from here. And as this account here from the left-wing paper New America, puts it. This is Rustin talking about nonviolence. This is why I'm a socialist, he says, why I revere the contributions of Randolph. He's kept alive the great lesson of Reconstruction, that there can be no political or social freedom without economic justice, plain and simple. A theme not highlighted in the Netflix program. If you jump ahead just a couple of years, Rustin is also a key player in putting forward the Freedom Budget for All Americans, a program that the Randolph Institute, by this point, that Rustin is spearheading, puts forward to end poverty over the course of a decade by investing $100 billion. A lot of money back then, to rebuild America's city and to achieve, as the cover of the document calls it, freedom from want. Rustin was a key player there. In the mid-1960s, Rustin advocated a shift in focus. The title of this very important and often cited or invoked piece, From Protest to Politics. He lays out a case that the civil rights movement accomplished many things. There was much more to accomplish. The economic dimension was absolutely fundamental. And to make this happen, the civil rights movement really needed allies, needed to broaden its scope, to assemble an alliance, to helped to bring about more fundamental economic reform in the country. This was too much to ask of the civil rights movement by itself. Allies were absolutely needed. And Rustin, as I said at the outset, was an activist. He was a speaker. He was a writer, a thinker, an intellectual, and he wrote a lot. And he tried to make the case, and this is just a slide with many of the titles of articles and pamphlets that he contributed, but he tried to build the case for this alliance and why the freedom struggle needed to reorient itself in a more explicitly political and electoral direction. These words came at an awkward time, one could argue. Rioting was breaking out across the United States in the mid and late 1960s, something that kind of underscored Rustin's belief that greater political solutions were needed to address economic issues. There was the war in Vietnam that was beginning to tear the nation apart at this time. Now, the freedom budget ultimately went nowhere fast, and the alliance that Rustin sought to create didn't really congeal. And in 1968, Richard Nixon won the presidency. In a retrospective piece a number of years ago, Peter Dreyer reflected on the final decades of Rustin's life. So they were something of an anticlimax, he said. He continued organizing work with civil rights, peace, and labor movements. He was in demand as a speaker, still valued for his strategic brilliance, but he never again had the same influence he did when organizing the Washington March. I think that assessment is a bit unfair to Rustin after the 1960s, and it minimizes his contributions to broader social change. In the late 1960s, Rustin was not a participant, but attended, visited Memphis during the sanitation workers' strike and advised King, who participated in and spoke at and ultimately gave his life in service of. He briefly was attached to the Poor People's March, though he had profound differences with some of the other organizers. He led the A. Philip Randolph Institute that was created with money from the American Federation of Labor, the AFL-CIO, to engage in work supporting Black trade unionists, voter registration and education, and the like. And in the 1970s, until Randolph's passing in 1979, he was a friend as well as ally and a supporter of Randolph in the last decade of his life, the years in retirement. Randolph was, Rustin recalled, for me, a father, an uncle, advisor, defender. And Rustin did many things on behalf of Randolph in the 1970s. The 70s and especially the 1980s, Rustin traveled the world to Afghanistan, to Southeast Asia, working on behalf of refugees, supporting the right of Soviet Jews to emigrate from the USSR. He was arrested in 1984 at the Yale University during a civil disobedience event during the strike of the clerical and technical workers there. I was one of those protesting students. I was in graduate school at the time. It was the nicest arrest I've ever had, very friendly police officers. Rustin was there. I had no idea. I didn't know who he was. I was unaware of this. And it was only last year when talking to some friends about the Yale strike that this came up, that Rustin was there. So for one and only time in my life, I was in the same place that he was, but didn't know who he was. And for his friends, institutional and personal, there were the testimonial dinners and celebrations of his decades of political activism from the late 30s, early 40s onward. a cause for celebration. And I love these two drawings here from the New York Hilton celebration in 1987. I want to return in my final moments to the question, how do we not know who Bayard Rustin is, as his biographer John D'Amelio once put it? And here are the answers that D'Amelio gives. First of all, he said Rustin had been a communist. He was also a pacifist, another identity difficult to incorporate into notions of American heroism, and he was a gay man. Put that all together, put these liabilities together, a communist past, in Cold War America, a pacifist in an armed-to-the-teeth national security state, a homosexual during the years that one historian is labeled the Lavender Scare. And one can understand why Rustin would have developed a style of leadership that tended to keep him out of the public eye. It's not quite clear to me that he was out of the public eye, given the amount of attention that at least the press gave him at key moments in the 1960s and to a lesser extent 1970s. But Rustin himself highlighted some of these points. I believe it was 1950 that he told his friend Sheldon Weeks, or this is how Weeks reports it, I belong to every minority group possible: communist, socialist, radical, pacifist, Quaker, black, homosexual, end quote. And as a tribute, reflection piece put it some 2 decades ago, Rustin was black, politically outspoken, pacifist, communist, and socialist. This was at any time in American history a dangerous combination. But he was also an openly gay black man. By very nature of this, he was a subversive. Or as another put it from 2013, he was relegated to a supporting role, not just because he was good at it, but because of his overt homosexuality and his brief period of activism with the Communist Youth League in the 1930s that had made him a pariah. I'm not convinced that by the 60s, and certainly after that this was really at play in accounting for how Rustin was forgotten or erased or simply removed from the images of the history of the civil rights movement, though this may well play a part. And perhaps in our discussion, people can talk about this or weigh in on whether they think how important these factors were. I would also like to add very quickly the political dimension that makes Rustin, or has made Rustin at times, something of a figure that was kind of harder to kind of fit into the frames that historians have put forward in the last number of decades. Rustin's politics don't always line up with those of the practitioners in the historical profession. For all of his radicalism, he wasn't as radical as some others. In 1964, for example, the participants in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the alternative slate that was dispatched to the Atlantic City Convention of the Democratic National Convention, seeking to displace the all-white segregationist delegation. Rustin sides with the administration and suggests that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegates accept a compromise. In the future, segregated delegations will be barred. For the moment, take 2 at-large positions and let it pass. This did not sit well with the members of that political faction in Mississippi, nor with the New Left and others who were moving to the left at this time. Then there was the issue of Black Power. Rustin was a critic, no fan whatsoever. Here in 1966, he says, "It's just another slogan for those who don't have a program." And that was Rustin being nice about Black Power. At times, he could be far, far harsher. But this is a moment in which the popularity of the phrase and the style of protest politics that some young African-American activists and their white supporters were coming to appreciate and celebrate even more. This put him somewhat against the grain of at least part of the political trajectory of the 1960s. In 1968, Rustin takes part or supports the United Federation of Teachers in the strike at the Ocean Hill-Brownsville conflict. Proponents of community control in the Black community seek to oust a number of white Jewish teachers, completely ignoring the union contract. This brings the union out on strike. It divides the broader civil rights community / coalition. Rustin and Randolph side with the teachers union. This is not how you go about bringing about change. They put themselves on record opposed to the community control activists, and in subsequent years, many historians, that puts them on the wrong side of the issue. I don't share that view, but I think it helps to kind of account for how Rustin and Randolph don't quite fit in with the sensibilities of at least some historians. And there's the Vietnam War. This is the conflict that by the second half of the decade in the early 1970s dominates the headlines. The anti-war movement grows by leaps and bounds. The backlash grows by leaps and bounds. Americans are divided. And many, not all, many in the civil rights community side with the growing anti-war protests. Dr. King does so, not so much the established organizations, the Urban League, the NAACP, and Rustin, who believes that it is imperative to kind of maintain solid relations with the Johnson administration, does not take part in the broader anti-war movement. And for activists at the time and for historians since, that puts them on, some historians since, that puts them on the wrong side of that political issue. Then there was support for Israel. Liberal African-American leaders were strongly supportive of the state of Israel, something that members of the New Left and the Black Power movement were not, particularly after 1967. But Rustin was prominent in organizing support for Israel, and among left-wing activists then, and some historians now, that too didn't exactly make him someone whose past was usable or something to be celebrated. And for his efforts, the amount of hate mail that he received, this gets its own folder in the Rustin papers. These are some of the nicer hostile things that were said. They get a lot worse. And then Rustin was an advocate of a Black-white civil rights labor alliance. And as head of the Randolph Institute, he did considerable work toward making that happen. But the American labor movement by the 1970s was not seen by those on the left as a particularly progressive force. And some historians, kind of imbibing that influence, also sees the AFL-CIO as a stodgy institution. Again, not something necessarily to be celebrated. All of that said, this is history. Whatever take you may have on it, that doesn't appear in the Netflix documentary. Perhaps it can't. When I raise some of these issues after I watched it the first time with my wife, she says, "What do you expect? It's an hour-and-a-half movie. It can't do everything." And I concede that is the case. And I think what it does very well. But I hope that what it also does is whet your taste for history and inspires you and others to look more deeply into the life and legacy of Bayard Rustin. And as I said at the outset, Brother Outsider is a documentary film that is available on Netflix that I would strongly urge people to view next if you haven't viewed the documentary already. So that is my film recommendation of the day. I've attempted in the last 45 minutes to lay out something of the life and legacy of Rustin. I've left out many things. I've emphasized some things more than others, but I hope that I've conveyed my own admiration for this absolutely important individual whose role in the civil rights and peace movements was absolutely central to their successes. I am going to stop at this moment. And as promised, we can open this up for discussion. I have offered my take. I am not a movie critic, so I see some things, I don't see others. You have all, hopefully many of you have seen this yourself and will have things to say. So on that front, I will invite folks to kind of weigh in on what I've said, on what they saw on the screen. What do you make of all of this?
Can you hear me or see me?
Yes, Rochelle, hello. It's been
Hello.
a long time.
I took off my picture and I can't get it back on. But anyway,
Oh, it's on.
see you.
I see you.
me. Okay, good. I don't see me. I just want to say a few quick things and let the discussion go on. First of all, I did work for Bayard from 1957 through 1973, 4. And then I went to work for the American Federation of Teachers. So brothers and sisters, I'm here. And Eric, I could not agree more with your presentation. I mean, every so often I would write down something on a pad. He left it out and then you would do it. So it was really a great presentation. So I just want to get to the movie. Your wife is right. It's a movie. They did consult. I was pro bono because with me a lot about it because I wanted to be free to write the op-ed page that said this is shit, and they actually did it well, pretty well for a movie. The thing that I wanted to point out that we tried to point out to them a million times and we couldn't get it done is that it wasn't only that we were a bunch of kids on the phones, that the reason we could get 250,000 people to Washington is that we were dealing with established institutions that had bases that could put them on the buses. So for instance, if you look at who came to the March on Washington, it was trade unionists. And I've forgotten the name of a Teamster leader out of Missouri who did absolutely, and there were other Teamster leaders around.
Ernest Callaway,
you got it, who did an absolutely fantastic job. But also it was all the unions that participated, and it was the Black Church and the NAACP. It was established organizations. And then the rest of the people, they did, spontaneous people came, but it could have never worked without the trade union movement. And one of the consultations, Eleanor Norton, I don't know whether anybody is here from Washington, she's our congresswoman who is in the movie also, she said it about 50,000 times. Without the trade union movement, you can't do it. What I considered a success about the movie is that we managed to get, thank God, in a movie, the trade union movement not presented as an opponent of civil rights. Eric deals with that. I mean, you get that all the time. So you do get the UAW participating. We didn't get enough of the other unions participating, but nobody's hostile to them. We considered that a virtue. And we did not have to deal with, and I must say the screenwriter, Lance Black, understood that because other people wanted to put in the line, George Meany opposed the March on Washington. And while Meany himself didn't want the AFL-CIO to endorse it, all the unions were free to participate. So I want to hear what you thought about the rest of the movie, which is unfortunately, Eric, I thought was very restrained. There are many historical problems with that movie, many scenes that didn't take place, but the overall phenomenon of taking Bayard actually into history, he is taken to a mass of people, Eric, who never heard of him. And I will just tell you that Coleman Domingo, who is a brilliant actor, and who you'll be happy to know on every movie or theatrical site, Equity appoints a deputy. It's like a shop steward. And guess who the Equity deputy always is? It's always Coleman Domingo. He embodies in spirit and heart Bayard. So anyway, let me let you talk about the movie. And if you have any questions about anything that's accurate or inaccurate, I'd be glad to answer it. The character, I can't resist. The character Elias was thoroughly made up. He's fictional. He didn't exist. The other thing that bothered me a lot about the movie, I've been going on also too long, is there's Tom Kahn's father. They do talk about it, was the president of a local union in Brooklyn. And they gratuitously put in a speech where Kahn says his father was a racist. Kahn's father was never a racist. May have been a communist. He wasn't a racist. But that, I mean, there's gratuitous things there, but I'll keep quiet and let you talk.
Thank you so much. I have to say, when I saw your name and picture when we first started, it was like, uh-oh.
You're right. I am the uppo vigilante. No, you were wonderful. I could not be happier.
I am relieved. Thank you. Folks, screen's yours. What are your thoughts? I know some of you've seen the movie.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yes, I think Chris needs to unmute, or someone needs to unmute Chris. There you go, Chris.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank Anthony Rosa and the HRDC for putting this Zoom together. Excellent presentation. I'd also like to thank Karen Jones for helping to integrate LGBT history into the labor history, which is woefully unrepresented in my humble opinion. And this is a good step forward. And this is one of the ways that we can do it. Now we're getting traction because of the film Rustin, and also because of the Coors boycott, which I just attended, and so did Director Rosa, a conference in New Orleans for the NGLTF. They had a labor institute at Pride at Work. And one of the things that was played for the group there was a pre-recorded message from Cleve Jones, who was, part of the Coors boycott and supported the first openly gay elected official, Harvey Milk. And Cleve recalls in this, singles out the Teamsters as having made it possible to form that coalition. And that was very important because we're sometimes, and not, mistakenly, but sometimes people put on the Teamsters about the element of the Teamsters that does have a history of non-inclusive policy. And all of those hard-won, I thought the film did a very good job at calling out the fact about the efforts to desegregate the military and all of these milestones. And I think, Rochelle, thank you for being here, by the way, and for your lifelong, dedication and participation in civil rights. But what the film, she rightfully points out that this is an hour and a half, 90 minutes. And so when I read these reviews, there's all kinds of people saying that could have been Coleman Domingo did a good job, but that could have been a way better film. And I said, to make you laugh and cry and give a overall sense of the history involved in 90 minutes is a pretty damn good job. I think that the best summation of the film is in a trailer that President Obama made, which introduces the film. We just, in the Teamsters LGBTQ plus caucus, we've been doing screenings. We contacted the producer, Bruce Cohen, who is an out activist producer who has produced films like Milk and American Beauty, Tu Wong Fu, now Rustin. And he was able to get the people at Netflix to legally authorize us to display the film free of charge. And that was a really big thing. We're having people across the country in Teamster land, as I like to call it, doing these screenings and inviting membership because we want it to be a unifying, event to kind of bring people into knowing something that they didn't know. When we marched in the King Day parade, woefully few people even knew who Rustin was. You know, we had the banners of different LGBT union and political activists over the years that nobody knew who they were. And so I appreciate the context. This was not just about the film. This was a big overall picture of how that fits in. But I do notice that, you know, in the materials that were presented, let's not forget that, let's contextualize this, that the people that were writing these had a bent, and it's what you could get away with writing back then. So a lot of the things that we're taking or we're seeing are not necessarily gospel of how things were. It's what could be printed. And that's a big difference between what's printed and what's actually the reality, because now there's nobody really with the sensibility of our frame of reference today. And so you're getting these articles, Mary McCrary and the different people that write these things, and they're coming from their frame of reference, which is predominantly, if not exclusively, you know, the white experience of a working journalist at that time. And there's a lot of things that would not, you know, they used to say the sin that cannot be named. And so there's
That's great. Chris, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for those words.
Yes, sorry for going on so
I'd
long.
like to.
Thank you very much for
That's
the
all right.
presentation.
I'd just like to interject. This is Anthony Rosa. I'd like to, Eric, as usual, you always put on a great education. And the young lady that spoke before, Michelle, thank you for all that history. Oh, you're wonderful.
Thank you.
I could have listened to you and Eric for another hour.
So,
You're available, I
Thank
think.
you.
so comments from other folks. What did you think? Myron, I see you're on. I see some other folks that, Alex, you're on. What did you guys think about the discussion about the movie?
Peter Walrond also has a hand up,
Okay.
and then Dom Prisi. So, Peter, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yep. Hi guys. I thought the movie was absolutely brilliant. I myself, being a rookie organizer, kind of tied myself to that movement and the power of when all walks of life come together for change. But I just didn't understand the Pasadena situation with Mr. Rustin there. Why was that such a focal point? He was an openly gay male. I don't know if he was when the Pasadena situation happened, but why was that the focal point to hold him like in blackmail type of situation?
Homosexuality was actually illegal.
Yeah.
And he was caught by the police in the back seat of a car doing immoral things. And
Can I just say a word about
sure.
it? In olden days, the police had nothing better to do than to set up and arrest homosexuals. So in the Johnson White House, for instance, Walter Jenkins, who was a Johnson aide, married, had 8 children, or something like that, but was also gay, was set up and arrested in a bathroom for sexually. Bayard was set up in Pasadena. That is, 2 police informants seduced him, and then they came and arrested him. But if you're thinking about we're thinking about a period when we didn't talk about being homosexual. I mean, the fact that Bayard never hid it was a very big deal. So, and he had a Pasadena arrest, and he was charged with lewd and indecent behavior. He served 2 weeks in jail for it, and he was himself of two minds about it. He was furious that they set him up, and he felt very guilty that they let him set him up. He had to immediately resign from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I mean, he was ostracized because of that arrest. It was only during the march when Strom Thurmond put it out publicly that Bayard could sort of be relieved. But even after the march, Bayard would go to speak. The John Birch Society would give out the police record from Pasadena. And Bayard went up to various schools, and they would give out that leaflet discussing lewd and disgusting acts. And Bayard would courageously, I never could get over it, walk through a line where his police record was given. And the movie, I know the movie goes fast over it, but it was like the secret we show. I mean, not only was he gay, but he was arrested for lewd and indecent behavior.
Thank you.
That part fills up a lot for me. Thank you.
Dominic Precy, and then how about Alex Murphy after?
If there's a moment of quiet, I would just like to say one more thing. I'm sorry, and this is my last thing. Eric, when you talked about the movie, people not being known, one of the incredible benefits of this movie is to young Black gay men who did not know that Bayard Rustin existed. And Coleman Domingo himself tells the story of being 19 years old at Temple University, going to an African-American student thing. He was openly gay, and he says, he will describe with anger, all of a sudden they say Bayard Rustin. He said, why didn't I know about him? And he is and this movie, I think you can tell me more, serves as sort of an inspiration and an opening for young Black gay men, or certainly young gay people that that just hadn't existed, that we haven't seen before.
I'll try. Just a quick question. This is directed to Eric, and this may indirectly go to Rochelle's point as to what we can do with this biography. I'm just wondering the significance of the, for lack of a better term, diminution of his prominence in his career after the march, coinciding with the progressively more fragmentation of politics in the subsequent decades. To what extent do you think that he was as successful as he was before the Washington March, because the issues were perhaps a lot more clear and we were not as fragmented? I mean, he certainly is inspirational for obvious reasons, but with the politics of today, could a Bayard Rustin be as successful in the 80s and 90s and in 2000s as he was in the 50s and the 40s, 50s, and early 60s today, given where we are? I mean, are things more complicated now than they were back then?
Very interesting question. My short answer is I don't know, but my slightly longer answer would be, in the 40s and 50s, to the extent that he's successful in certain communities, right? The peace community is not a large community. Most Americans do not subscribe to the philosophy and spirit of nonviolence. So within kind of certain subcultures, he is a terrific and valued speaker, but he's certainly not a household name. Within the civil rights community, he's increasingly known, and he performs brilliantly in 1963 because he's both attached to organizations and has a particular task, and there is a mission that people agree on. The film shows that when divisions within the coalition putting on the march result in, let's see, compromises. So it's a one-day march, not a two-day march. There's not going to be civil disobedience. They're not going to ring around the White House. Many of the younger activists are dismayed and are unhappy. In the end, the march is tremendously successful. But what's also not shown in the film is John Lewis and his speech. The original version, which is incendiary, fiery, it rejects the Kennedy Civil Rights Bill as too little, too late, and then his slightly watered down version, which is still pretty incendiary, that he ultimately gives after certain groups threaten to walk and not participate in the march. From that point on, some of those fracture lines become much, much deeper. So it's not clear to me the extent to which the issues are simple in the 60s, say, and more complicated in the 1970s and 1980s, but the civil rights movement itself is more divided. Certain victories have been won. The 64 and 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts are absolutely incredibly important. Then things get sticky. The economic dimension that drove Randolph and Rustin and others is not something that resonates in Congress in the late 1960s onward. And I would also say that Rustin remains quite visible and quite valued within certain organizations and constituencies and subcultures in the 1970s and 1980s. So it's not like he vanishes. The larger question about why we don't remember him is a parallel but slightly distinct question to which John D'Amelio had some answers. I offered some additional thoughts there. But ultimately, I guess I would say, in this wonderful thing called American culture, where we're all so well read and so knowledgeable about so many different things, there seems to be only room for one figure, and that's King. As important as he is, that's what's emphasized. Occasionally they throw in some Rosa Parks and schools, but after that, the very rich cast of characters, some of which make appearances, cameo or larger in this film, people don't know. Unless they are real history devotees, do this stuff for a living, or like to watch lots of documentaries. So Pauli Murray, who is not a key figure at all, not a figure at all in this film, is a fascinating and important figure whose life is also tremendously interesting. But that requires watching a different documentary on, I believe, Amazon, and or reading, some of the biographical works there. But these folks aren't incorporated into kind of a broader common understanding of civil rights. People just aren't that historically minded. And to the extent that this history comes up, let's see, in February, there are some kind of rote events or themes that get hammered away that are fairly simplistic, and I think that's unfortunate. I'm not sure I answered your question, but there you have it.
Thank you.
Can I just take a shot?
Please.
Bayard knew it was going to be more complicated, and he said it. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to create a full employment economy, or to fix a city that has been divided by bridges and communities broken down. I mean, that is a question. In the early days, one didn't deal with institutional racism, one dealt with segregation and sort of Jim Crow. Bad as it was, it didn't get to the fundamental issues. Excuse me. When he wrote From Protest to Politics, he knew that's what he meant. And I think, it's an involving, difficult problem. And Barack Obama says, that Barack Obama was an organizer, so he stood on Bayard Rustin's shoulders. But we are in, I believe, a much more difficult situation, a much more fundamental situation. And we are in a situation, I think, where people don't believe in organizations and don't believe in leaders, that they like to have I mean, one of the good things the movie did was show that organization was good. You don't have to press a mob button to have everybody come, that you have to have demands and stuff. But it is an incredibly difficult situation now. And Bayard, I think, would be the first to say yes. I wanted to say one thing to Eric about Yale. In this moment, one of the contenders for the Academy Award, the Oscar, is Paul Giamatti. His father was president of Yale then. The other contender is Coleman Domingo playing Bayard Rustin. When John Wilhelm, who was the president of the local union at Yale, came to Bayard and asked him to please demonstrate for the striking workers, he was soon followed by Giamatti's father, who came to the Randolph Institute office in New York. I had left, Walter Nagel told me this, to try to convince Bayard not to march with the striking workers. And what was Giamatti's first name? I don't remember it.
Bart.
Bart. He got so adamant that he banged his hand on Bayard's desk. It had a glass top, and he broke the glass. He apologized profusely. Bayard went up and got arrested in that demonstration. It was the last arrest before Bayard died. But anyway, so Walter Nagel, Bayard's partner, and I keep on referring to this Oscar award as a Giamatti against Rustin once again.
That's great. The one thing I remember is of this is that the Yale police, the police did not want to make any arrests at all. It's like, you can block the street, it's a side street. It's like, who cares? And that the organizers had to threaten to escalate. It's like, no, we really want to be arrested. And so we'll go to the president's house, we'll block more traffic, but really this is much easier for everyone. So in the end, they relented, they made the arrest. And I recalled going into the police station, there were signs up that said, "Welcome Yale strikers." A big shift, say from like the 1930s. You got to pick your arraignment date. It was like everyone took out their little address, their calendars, and it's like, oh yeah, Thursday the 24th might be good for me. It's like, okay, fine, that's good. It was the most obliging police protest encounter I had ever been part of.
Does Alex Murphy, are you still out there? Do you still have your question?
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not so much a question, it's just the film was real eye-opening for me because as a person who was still infatuated with Dr. King and his teachings, it's great to see that it was another Black man standing hand in hand, not only Black, but as a gay man in a time where it was not only dangerous, but deadly to be so, to stand there and put such a great performance for not only workers, but freedoms of everyone. But I think it was a great film and a great presentation by all.
One of the things that I liked about the movie, and in terms of thinking about history, is it shows how important the passion is. That you have to really believe in what you're doing, and that you have to put yourself in the fire, so to speak, to make things happen. And I think we forget that it wasn't just some march where everybody got on buses and came. There was all kinds of passion and anger and conflict that was happening. That's the history. That's what made these events happen. That's what, when I talk about our Teamster history, I talk about the passion that people had at that time. And so when I watch the movie and when I see the character of Bayard Rustin, I see that fire, that passion, and it makes me think, who do we have today that could match that? And I'm not sure we got a lot of people that could match some of that. Maybe they're just hidden there. The song he sings about letting my little light shine. I don't think a lot of people are letting their little light shine today. And so maybe if we take anything from this movie, it's to step up and do what he did. We don't have the same dangers he did, but we still need to show that light. We still need to show that passion. And that's what I took from the movie. I also think it would be a great idea, you know, at the end of the March on Washington, everybody signed those little cards that said they would uphold the ideals, blah, blah, blah. Well, I think it would be a good idea if we did that same sort of thing with our members, that we will uphold the ideals in the Teamster Constitution, that everyone is welcome and so forth. But that's just me as the historian speaking out of her hat. So.
No, I think it's a great idea, Karen. You're not speaking out of your hat. And I think it's a wonderful idea.
Any other
I'm going to
thoughts,
see what I can do
folks?
about that.
We've got a hand up from Paul Dasher. If you would unmute.
Morning, everybody. This is
Hello.
Paul Dasher from Local 117's ST. Karen, Eric, everybody else that's participating today, thanks for showing up for this. And to kind of dovetail with what you were saying, Karen, right? We have to take action and participate and find inspiration where we can. And one of the quotes that I hung on to last night from the movie is that inspiration untethered by action, or untethered to action, it loses all its value. And that dovetails right with what you said, Karen, and it's something I hope to hang on to for good. So again, thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
Other thoughts?
Yes, I have a question. This is Ruben Torres. After the march, Martin Luther King in the movie came out and publicly finally thanked Bayard for his efforts and for what he's done. And it seemed like they portrayed it where he was no longer afraid to publicly have a friend who is homosexual. Do you think within the civil rights movement, that moment validated all his efforts, made the movement more accepting towards people who are gay? What impact, if any, do you think that moment inspired or taught?
That's
I've crashed this meeting, so I'm going to crash some more. The problem with Dr. King and Bayard, Dr. King always knew Bayard was gay. He knew Bayard was gay when he went and lived in the basement. He knew why he was living in the basement in Alabama. It was Adam Clayton Powell who threatened to tell people that Dr. King was having an affair with Bayard. That was the threat. And that was the threat that the young Dr. King in 1960 could not withstand, primarily not because of himself, but because of the homophobia of the Black Baptist Church and his own father. I mean, Dr. King himself was under tremendous pressure. And he and Bayard had reestablished the relationship. The movie exaggerates. Bayard never lost his phone number. Dr. King and Bayard were in conversation during the Birmingham demonstrations. I don't know what impact that had. Coleman Domingo thinks that one of the good things about the movie is it showed that a Black gay man and a Black heterosexual man could be deep friends and could be comrades. And he himself, Coleman, who is the leader of all this, I think, these days, is very happy about that they were able to establish in the movie that relationship. Whether it did at the moment in the march, I don't know. I interrupted you.
But Rochelle, I'm curious. Bayard and Randolph, going back, decades, that was also that friendship.
Yeah.
That long predated the relationship with King.
Yeah. Mr. Randolph was oblivious to all things not morally relevant. And there could be a scandal about Bayard. There could be a scandal about Paulie Murray, who is gay. There could be a scandal about another Black woman trade unionist, who I think was married to a Teamster, who also may have been gay. And Mr. Randolph just ignored that. It was, he had a strict, a man and a woman was a person, and that was it. Mr. Randolph's decision about Ocean Hill, Brownsville, there was all this community stir up about community control and blah, blah, blah. And I remember Mr. Randolph saying, the question is due process for trade unionists. I know where I stand. Simple. He was just a straight, moral human being.
Hear, hear.
Who deserves a biopic.
Yeah.
He really does. He really does. There's so much about Mr. Randolph. And what the movie doesn't make clear is that there's no way that those civil rights leaders could have been gotten into a room except by A. Philip Randolph. If it weren't for him, that unity would have never taken place. And the other thing that if you get to read, you want to read Mr. Randolph's speech at the March on Washington, it is filled with economics and revolution. It's the speech that Eric wants.
We are the advance guard of a massive moral revolution.
That's right. See, that's exactly what he said.
Well, he should have a biopic, but my mother suggests that in addition to the biography that I'm writing, I should do a musical.
Well, you know what? Coleman sings and dances.
Keep that in mind.
Keep it in mind. Coleman's available.
Excellent. Any more additional thoughts, folks?
I thought I saw somebody raise their hand.
Yes, Peter again. Unmute.
Hey guys. No, I just like the way the movie really portrayed like the politics and or the red tape of how the littlest of things could just kind of, sideline or derail a movement. And, we got to think, or at least I think that so many powerful movements probably were freaking knocked off its rails because of these kind of instances that we have in in the world. But when Bayard there sat on the bus and they did a quick flashback to him getting beat by the police for not giving up his seat, I just liken that to how many people tried to do what Rosa accomplished prior to her doing it, right? And it was kind of like so much that we've accomplished, we have so much to go. And those quick flashbacks really kind of gripped me when they happened in the movie.
I agree.
I just wanted to tell you one word about Bruce Cohn, who's helping you. Bruce Cohn's father is George Cohn. George Cohn was the head of the Federal Mediation Service for a while and is a labor lawyer. So Bruce doesn't suck it from the ground.
But on the issue of...
Go ahead, Eric.
No, someone else was speaking.
Yeah, I just thought I saw another, someone look like they were going to comment.
Well, until they, yes. Jenna, you are muted. If you unmute.
Sorry about that. I'm Jenna Mullins. I'm a Teamster in Local 399 in Hollywood, so I get to work on all these great movies. I thought the movie was excellent as far as like a gateway for getting people involved, as far as on a, standing up for themselves and banding together socially to make change. And I think that gives a lot of people hope when they see that. We haven't had a lot of that lately. Yes, there's marches. There's nothing in mass though. And I think that being a transgender person, that, a lot of us are very beat down in the same manner, the civil rights prior to the civil rights. And, it's just trying to get all of us together to stand up and latch on to the LGBTQ plus groups to do that. But, I just looked at it as a sampler movie, so to speak, after hearing all of your information, Eric and Rochelle, that you gave us. It really added so much thickness and more volume to the entire story. And that's what really sticks to me personally. Obviously, a movie like that not forced me, but made me want to come into this discussion, and hence I'm learning more. And that's a great thing I think that Hollywood's doing. They're taking that step to show these interesting people and characters, and then we can from there get tickled to find out the backstory in any manner that we can. And I really appreciate you coming together and putting out the information and the additional story of Rustin, because it to me it's important, and it shows how complex and full we are as people, and interesting we are too. So thank you.
Thank you. I like that phrase, sampler movie. And if this is the only thing people ever see, that's great. But if it actually makes people want to learn more, kind of gives a hint of just how rich this story and how many other stories there are out there are, and people then pursue that either through other documentaries or films or through books or through podcasts or through whatever, even better.
You know, it's interesting, and I just talked about this in a program that I did. As fragmented as the country was in the 1960s, we're even more so now. And it is very difficult. You can't have differing opinions without being, you know, harpooned for whatever you say, and people get their news from their own sources. And it makes me, Jimmy, you said something about pulling everybody together. And one of the things that I talked about in that program was it almost seems like what this country needs right now is another Apollo 13. Something that we can all focus on together. That was, you know, a horrible disaster. And no, I don't want that to happen again. But the fact that everyone for one instant could pull away from their own agendas and come together seemed to be a good kickoff for furthering some discussions. And maybe that's the kind of thing that we need now, a moment where we can all be one, and then in the aftermath of that, be able to speak to our differences. But that's just, you know, an idealist point of view, so.
I think this would be a good opportunity because the film is so impactful and because it's reached so many people, but a lot of people still have not yet seen it. But I would encourage everybody who, you know, wants to further this discussion to get active in their local and see if they can do a screening of Rustin, which starts a dialogue. Even though we were on our torrential flood here in Los Angeles, it was amazing the number of people who showed up. We had LA City Councilman Hugo Soto Martinez, who's a big union guy, and other people from the State Film Commission, and it was really well attended, and it started a discussion. And I think it, you know, especially with the support of Netflix in screening this, which is not a small, you know, feat. Because of Bruce Cohen interceding and getting the permissions necessary to do that, I think this would really be a great project for locals to take up. And then we can start a discussion. And then, like Jenna said, it will encourage people to, you know, that thirst for knowledge. Well, what about, and they'll want to, they have questions and they'll want to, you know, get more answers. So thank you very much for putting this all together. And once again, I think it was really an amazing discussion, and thanks for all the deep dive into the history of it.
Terrific, thank you. Any last thoughts before we go off and encounter the rest of our day?
Thank you for letting me intervene, but I really appreciate hearing all of your discussion about it. It's why a Teamster friend of mine got the notice and sent it to me and thought I might be interested in it. So I'm really glad to have met you folks.
Join us anytime. We do these once a month.
Good.
All right. If that's everybody, thank you once again, Eric, for a wonderful presentation. If our group can stay, our committee can stay on after everybody else goes about their getting ready for the Super Bowl activities, that would be great. And hopefully we'll see you all next month when we will be doing a presentation on Regina Polk, who was an up-and-coming wonderful business agent for the Teamsters, young woman who unfortunately died in a plane crash. So we'll be taking a look at her life and her rising leadership in the Teamsters. Thank you all.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Take care.